Welcome to That'll Preach. We've got Jay Thomas on the show. He serves as rector and pastor of St. Mark's Anglican Church in Moultrie, Georgia. And glad to have him to talk a little bit about Lent and what that means, fasting, all those kinds of spiritual exercises that have been very helpful for many people of the history of the church. So, Jay, thank you for being on the show with us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian. It's truly a joy to be with you today.
Tell us a little bit about St. Mark's Anglican Church. I know, Obviously, we have a mutual friend in another Anglican, Jay, and he goes to your church and enjoys it a great deal. But what's the story behind your church? If you want to just give a brief background.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think Jay must be like a prominent Anglican name. I think John Jay of the Federalist Papers was a notable Anglican from the founding of our country.
You guys are in good company.
Yeah, hopefully. Better than me, definitely. St. Mark's Anglican Church we're an old church founded in 1912 in Moultrie. For context, I think Moultrie as a town was only founded in the 1880s. So very old church, and originally St. John's Episcopal Church. For various reasons, we moved over into the Anglican Church in North America about a little over a decade ago. I've been here for about 2 years, but old historic congregation, really faithful people have been here. Some as long as baptized here and are still here to this day in their 80s. So we have a kind of congregation that spans all the demographics. Moultrie's a small town in South Georgia. We're just about an hour north of Tallahassee, Florida, where you're located, Brian. And we've got, we're kind of an ag county, lots of farming, and then the town of Moultrie, which is kind of the center of the county here. So it's a wonderful place to be, incredible people at this parish. And I'm just, this is my first pastorate and I'm absolutely loving it. So it's a good place.
Now, did you grow up in like a small town? Was this always something that you wanted to be involved with? Just a more, agriculturally centered, small town kind of feel?
I kind of yes and no. I did grow up for the first 10 years of my life in a small town. So I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is about an hour north of Santa Fe, up in the mountains. If you ever watched Oppenheimer, it's where the Manhattan Project took place. So it's a very small town. It's actually about the same size as Moultrie. But then for the rest of my life, I've lived in suburbs of huge cities. And my wife and I were not necessarily looking to go to a small town, but probably like any fellow millennial, we've become enamored with Wendell Berry, his concept of the membership, and looking for a place where we can truly build that type of community. And so when the opportunity came to look at a church in rural South Georgia, that just seemed like a godsend. And it was clearly God's calling, and just truly thankful to be here.
Yeah, I feel like if you meet someone who loves, caring for people in a smaller rural town, and they're Anglican or they're liturgical, Wendell Berry is like somewhere in the orbit of the of influences. But absolutely, I mean, I just read Hannah Coulter for the first time.
Oh, so good.
A couple months ago, maybe probably a year ago now, and it's amazing. I mean, it's just really, it really does kind of maybe almost, I guess it can kind of romanticize, but I think it just has this earthiness to it that really makes you be like, man, why don't we all just live in a small town and just, live our lives there?
It was interesting. I was actually just at a conference this past week, and Warren Colesmith, who was the former founding editor of World News Group and World Magazine, was commenting on Wendell Berry, and he mentioned that actually a lot of us will read Berry and think immediately, I got to get out of the city. I've got to move to the small town. Maybe I got to get rid of my computer. And he really helped me articulate that for Berry, it's less about the land, and not that the land isn't important for Berry, but more about community and the concept of what Berry, especially, I think he draws it out really well in Hannah Coulter, but his idea of membership, that we can't all live in a small town of 25, 100 people. But we can all find local communities, local small corporate entities, not corporate in the sense of like a LLC, but corporate in the sense of like multiple people that are all together involved and form a membership, a community that we truly belong to. And so whether you're in Moultrie, Georgia, Tallahassee, Florida, New York City, you can find that membership of people that are truly going to care for you. And that's kind of the ethos of the Wendellberry ideal, at least as Warren Cole Smith sees it. He could be totally wrong, but that's I thought that was a really helpful interpretation, and I'm running with it.
No, it sounds good to me. It sounds good to me. Now, you had mentioned that you grew up Lutheran. I remember you telling me off
Yes.
off a recording that you and then you became Anglican. You want to just describe what that process was like for you?
Yeah. So, oh man, that's like a whole podcast in itself. But
Well,
I
you
think
can do a condensed. You can do a condensed.
I'll do
version.
the real short version. In essence, when I went to college, the quick way of saying it is there was no Lutheran church in the area, and so I kind of had to figure out who my people were. And I like to jokingly say most kids doubt their faith in college. I just doubted my ecclesiology. So I found initially I'd kind of grown up in a very evangelical Lutheranism, so I gravitated toward more kind of interdenominational or non-denominational evangelicalism, and so that was kind of where I was just going to church on Sundays and the community I was networking into. And then, actually, very apropos for our conversation, Holy Week of my freshman year in college rolled around, and I looked at like our local church's schedule, and we had like a kind of semi-muted Palm Sunday observance, and then the next Sunday was Easter, but then there was nothing in between. And I felt like how I'd been formed my whole life in order to really appreciate the joy of the resurrection at Easter. I really needed to have walked with Jesus through his suffering and the cross. I needed that full Holy Week experience, not as an experience per se, but really as a way to live out my faith, so that I could truly enter into the joy of Easter. I had become good friends with some Roman Catholics who, honest to goodness, the first Roman Catholics I truly ever met in my life were in college, and I was not only shocked to find out that they were Christians, but they were inviting me to church, and so they invited me to church over Holy Week. So I joined with them, and I showed up at their Holy Thursday service of Holy Week, and realized that it was like a cut and paste from what I'd been doing my whole life in Maundy Thursday services at our Lutheran church. And so then for the next 4 years of college, I was just kind of in this, just trying to figure out where I belonged. I jokingly say, but it's true, that on my junior and senior years, I was planting a Southern Baptist church on Saturday nights. So I was part of the launch team for that, planting, getting it all off the ground. While on Sunday mornings, I would go and I would actually cantor and sing at the local Roman Catholic parish's mass. And wow. I was in confirmation classes to become Roman Catholic, but wasn't really sure about that. I couldn't join the local Southern Baptist church because I'd grown up Lutheran and I'd been baptized as an infant, and I wasn't willing to be rebaptized because I truly believe that God had worked his grace within me as a child. And I was kind of I was homeless ecclesiologically, you might say. And I left college. I like to jokingly say I was a non-denominational Catholic, which is the biggest, it just doesn't work. It's not
biggest
a real
oxymoron.
Thing. Yeah, biggest oxymoron in human history. And if you know anything about Anglicanism and our claim to be the via media between Protestantism and Catholicism, or our claim to be Reformed Catholicism, you'll know that somebody in my shoes, when we discover Anglicanism, will realize like, oh, this is what I was looking for, a truly evangelical expression of the faith, but one that had kept really that which was good from its Catholic heritage. So to not throw out the baby with the bathwater as it went through the Reformation. And so that was truly life-giving to me, and has continued to be life-giving to me.
So a guy who grew up Lutheran almost became Roman Catholic, and yes. Then found the safe shores. And what I'm just kind of curious, what kept you from going all the way to Rome when you were in that college period?
Well, there were really kind of two things. One is one's objective and one's subjective. And I think, as in all things, most of us who like to think that we're rational will say that the objective was more important. But the more I look back on it, I think the subjective was the most important. Objectively, I really struggled to square two main Roman Catholic doctrines in my head. The first was papal infallibility, and the second was the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Ironically, if I could square, and purgatory, specifically temporal purgatory of a punitive nature, and I realized that if I could assent to papal infallibility, then purgatory and the Immaculate Conception would just fall right in line. And so really that was the hang up was papal infallibility. And I really struggled with it. I remember I was talking to a really good friend of mine who was becoming Roman Catholic at the same time. But he was doing it to get married. And I left the confirmation classes, and he said, well, Jay, why are you leaving? And I explained, and he said, well, nobody cares about that stuff. I was like, well, I do. Maybe it was like my first sign of that I'm going to be, going to ministry someday. I was caring about all the nitpicky things. The subjective reason is I not only grew up Lutheran, but I grew up the son of a Lutheran pastor. Becoming Roman Catholic would have fundamentally meant breaking the communion with my family, entering into a totally different communion of Christ Church, and not being able to receive communion together with my parents. And I realized that that's a big step. And if I wasn't 100% convinced that, especially on papal infallibility, if I was considering assenting to it because if I was to assent to it, everything else would kind of make sense. But if I wasn't there yet on that, then to really break fellowship with my family was not what I was called to in that moment. And I think over the last decade or so, I think that's borne itself out. That I think I made I think God was leading me in that moment not to make that decision. And that's what really brought me kind of here today. But what's interesting with that is, I really explored Roman Catholic theology from really kind of a safe place. I didn't have a lot of angst going into it. I didn't have a lot of negative preconceptions, mainly because I just had a really strong group of really orthodox, faithful, conservative Roman Catholic peers that were kind of walking alongside me, especially through the Focus Missionary Program. So it built up for me an incredible rapport and respect for the Roman Catholic Church. So I'm not a Roman Catholic. I think that ship has probably sailed for me, and I'm thankful that God has led me to where I am. But definitely gave me a great deal of respect for a tradition that I've kind of grown up maybe stereotyping or presuming the worst about. And so I'm thankful that God also gave me that experience to realize that He is also at work in that communion of the church.
We'll talk a little bit about Lent, because I think when it comes to, and I think more and more, we were joking earlier, liturgy is kind of in with Baptist churches or non-denominational churches, people, church calendar, all this kind of stuff. And, and there's good and there's bad with that. And so I think it'd be helpful just to hear, since Lent isn't traditionally emphasized in many Baptist or evangelical circles, can you explain what it is and why some Christians throughout the history of the church have sought to observe it?
Yeah, so Lent, it's really funny. There's a lot of traditional things in the church that have these formal names, and that we thereby kind of ascribe to this like really formal, rigid practice, when in reality they're profoundly organic. Lent is one of those things. Even the word Lent, people will. I've heard it said, the word Lent is not in the Bible, but that's actually kind of not true, because the word spring is, and all that Lent is the word for spring. And that kind of points to the profound nature of it. Lent is just the name given to the observances that Christians would do during springtime. And I say that kind of jokingly because we know from the way the Jewish calendar, the month of Nisan, and all that works out, that Passover and thereby the Easter celebration always falls in spring, no matter what. So what Christians are doing in spring since the resurrection of Christ has always in some ways related to the resurrection, and also to Passover, this kind of dual relationship that is going on there. And so that's where the word Lent comes from. And so then the question is just, well, what were Christians doing as they were, contemplating and really preparing to mark the celebration of the resurrection? So for the period after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and the beginning of the kind of intense Christian purifications. Well, they were purifying, but the intense Christian persecutions in the 60s and then the 100s and the 200s. In that period, we begin to see a process of profoundly intensive catechetical formation in the early church. So this is before Constantine. It's before the legality of Christianity. And really what the early church is saying is, okay, first, it's illegal to be a Christian, and it's the legality varies depending on who's in charge at what moment and what governor, but it's roughly illegal. And if you're going to embrace an illegal faith, you need to really know what you're embracing. And if baptism is this kind of washing of new birth, and early Christians, especially in this first 100, 200 years of the church, were really concerned about what Hebrews talks about, where it talks about those who have once been enlightened, if they then fall away, cannot be restored. A huge question in that time period. And so there was a profoundly intentional engagement with saying, if people are going to come into the church, we're going to make sure that they are really well formed. And so Christians would go through, and it would change whether we're talking about like North Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean or Greece or that area, but relatively a 1 to 3 year period of preparation for their baptisms. And in that time, they would be prevented from knowing certain things. They would only be told like the very bare minimums. So they would be prevented from reading the scriptures, and they would only learn kind of the nuts and bolts of the creeds. Part of the reason for that is because having the scriptures in a lot of places was illegal. So you wouldn't just give that out to those who might be coming in just to rat you out later. And so it was a very kind of guarded process of 1 to 3 years for the early Christian catechumenate. And the culmination of that was always baptism at Easter. And as part of that, then, the catechumens would fast in that kind of last section as they were preparing for their baptisms. And different time periods of fasting grew up. One was they would fast for 7 days, which kind of marking the 7 days of creation, so that when you were baptized on your 8th day, so the new day of new creation. The other image would be to fast for 40 days. So Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days to fast. Then he comes out of the wilderness, and he begins kind of his public ministry. So you too should fast for 40 days, then you can be baptized and enter into the public life of the church. Also echoing kind of the image of Israel wandering the wilderness for 40 years before they're able to enter the promised land. So those are kind of, and so then that practice, as you have one section of the church fasting, it became then a corporate fast. So now everybody is preparing for Easter because everybody's fasting because, well, I mean, these people are about to give their life to something in which the punishment for doing it is almost certain death. Like, we should be praying for them. And so the corporate church will begin to pray and fast for those who are about to be baptized. And so by the time kind of, you could say, Christianity comes out of the shadows, after it becomes legal after Constantine, they begin to kind of codify things that had already been done. And one of those was, okay, well, Easter is the time of baptism, and the time of preparation for baptism is this period before it, which happens in the spring. So we'll call it the thing that Christians do in the spring, and so we'll call that Lent. And so Lent, what Lent really is a time of prayer and spiritual discipline that prepares you for the feast of the resurrection. Whether that is your own baptism, the baptism of someone else, or just commemorating and remembering the resurrection of Christ, or entering into it in your own life. So I don't know if maybe that was too theoretical or too historical, but that's maybe an idea of like where Lent comes from, why we call it Lent, and kind of the origins of it in the first place.
Well, you were talking about the idea that it started organically from this need to prepare, but also this formative impulse to say, like you were saying, if you're going to join this illegal religion, you better be serious about this. It's kind of like it was almost a way of really pressing the sacrifice that this was going to require in a particular time. And fasting, you were mentioning, whether it was 7 days before or 40 days, that's hard to fathom. That's pretty amazing. Yeah. Why did fasting in particular have such a pivotal role in this time? Especially for catechesis and all these types of things, why do they gravitate towards fasting as one of the main disciplines?
Yeah, so I've kind of I've wrestled with this question a lot myself, and especially with like the applicability of fasting and what actually fasting is. What's really interesting when we begin to engage with the scriptures is fasting is all throughout the Bible and is really never explained. Like it's just kind of like taken for granted. We have this great conversation with Jesus and his disciples saying, on one hand, they're looking at John the Baptist who fasts and they see him as this kind of crazy guy. And then they look at me who eats and they say I'm a drunkard and a glutton. But once again, we're never told really kind of how John the Baptist fasts. Jesus tells the Pharisees, he says, after the bridegroom leaves, then my disciples will fast, or when you fast. And then also, we have Jonah going to Nineveh and they repent with fasting and sackcloth and ashes and all these things. So fasting is this like it seems to be this incredibly intuitive principle that's really never explained, which then has forced me to ask, if my question of what is fasting, it kind of becomes, I'm probably making it too complicated. And I think that's kind of a lot of, if I was to go, do a quick like Google search and I was to say fasting and diet, or modern fasting, or trendy fasting, everything would have to do with food. But then all of a sudden you like go to a Christian blog and it's like, oh, you should fast from Facebook. Or, hey, this year it'd be really great if we all did a fast from porn. Well, no, you should just stop doing porn anyways. But like we don't fast from things that aren't food. And this is like a really interesting concept that I've had to begin to understand. The reason that fasting is just so taken for granted in both the Old and New Testaments is because probably the most basic of our needs is food. I mean, the great 1940s American psychologist Abraham Maslow talks about his hierarchy of needs, and the base is food and shelter. But it doesn't take like a PhD psychologist to tell you that food is a basic need. It just takes anybody skipping a meal accidentally because maybe you brought your food to lunch or to work, and then it got spoiled on the way, and then you can't eat your meal, and then you're hungry all day and you're miserable. We know that we need food so profoundly. And so what fasting is it is a very intentional action by which we deprive ourselves. And through that act of deprivation, we discipline ourselves. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians disciplining his body. And he's using the term that Paul will use all over throughout the New Testament is that of ascesis, or training. The idea of ascesis is one of not just like physical training, but of mastery. We want to master a subject. If you want to paint a great work of art, you need to master the technique. If you want to be able to discipline your body, you have to master it. Not because the body is bad, but because you are called, to present your body to God as a sacrifice, like Paul says in Romans. So you're called to to take control of your body, because your body is also a temple of the Holy Spirit. Your body is also part of the body of Christ. And so fasting is this act of ascesis, of discipline, where we subject our body for a specific purpose. And that specific purpose is growth in the spiritual life. So fasting, just because you want to lose weight, is fasting. I mean, you're not eating a meal per se, or you're skipping, or you're eating a lighter meal, but it's not spiritual fasting. And I think that's an important thing to kind of wrap our minds around. So when the Bible talks about fasting, it's recognizing that, the faith is going to ask really hard things of us. I used that, kind of talked about the early centuries of the Christian church. They knew the faith was going to ask something hard for them. They might be taken to an arena where there were lions wanting to eat them. Well, we might not face that in modern day America, but that doesn't mean the faith isn't asking hard things of us. And, I like to tell people, if you really think that you would die for Jesus, but you aren't willing to forego a meal for Jesus because it's hard, well, then why do you think you would die for him? What fasting does is it normalizes for us depriving ourselves of our desires for the end of union with Christ. So that when something actually hard is asked of us, maybe we have to lose our job in order to cling to our Christian convictions, or maybe we have to take a pay cut, or maybe we have to move so we can be closer to our church. Whatever these things are, we're not going to be prepared to make those hard decisions for the faith unless we're routinely building a spiritual habit of making small decisions small decisions of deprivation to build that discipline, so that when the truly hard things come, we're prepared.
That's a great way to describe it. And I do think that there's this sense of, like you put it, why do you think you would die for Christ, or even just be persecuted in any measure, socially alienated or mocked or whatever it would be, if you're unwilling to skip a meal for Christ? That's a very powerful point. So talk a little bit about how Lent's actually practiced in terms of, generally speaking, it seems like Lent, you do pick no Facebook for 40 days. Is the expectation that you should actually fast for 40 days? How do you guys do it at your church? What does that look like practically in terms of the Lenten season?
Yeah, so the way Lent is practiced throughout the church, and I mentioned earlier when we were talking historically, that the practice of Lent grew organically in different ways in different places. So what the church in Alexandria was doing was different from what the church in Antioch was doing, which was different from what the church in Rome was doing. So I can really only speak out of my own tradition, and because the way I, as an Anglican, will fast during Lent will look different than maybe the way a Roman Catholic or a Lutheran or an Eastern Orthodox will fast during Lent. So I'll kind of caveat that. So right now I'm maybe going to speak a little bit specifically Anglican, but hopefully from there, general principles can be gleaned from it. So in the Anglican tradition, we kind of order our life by the Book of Common Prayer. If you're not familiar with the Book of Common Prayer, most people, when they flip through the pages, they'll think oh, okay, it's kind of like a neat little service book. Tells me how to do a marriage, tells me how to do a funeral. It's a nice little plug and play book. The great Anglican spiritual theologian Martin Thornton said that in reality, the Book of Common Prayer is not a liturgy resource book, but rather it is a compendium of Christian living. It's a rule of life that shapes the entire Christian experience from cradle to grave. The prayer book has in it the thanksgiving for the life of a child, and then it also has the final services of Christian burial. And everything between, it brings you all throughout your life, and then it has prayers and practices to accompany you throughout that, including ways to pray every single day of your life. And part of that are seasons of fasting. So within the Anglican Church, we have two major seasons of fasting. So one of those is Lent. That's kind of our biggest one, what we're talking about today, but also Advent. And so the best way to think about it is we prepare for our feasts. So before the great feast of Easter, we want to fast in preparation. We want to really hone our bodies, get our bodies under control as we begin to contemplate what is going to mean to be joining Christ in our resurrected bodies at the end of the age. Same way in Advent, we are subjecting our bodies as we contemplate what it meant that Christ himself took on a human body in the incarnation. And then in that human body also, then he went and fasted for 40 days on our behalf. So we're kind of those two seasons of fasting. And then we have a couple other days throughout the year. So we have 4 seasons of what are called Ember Days, where we fast specifically for those in the Christian ministry. And then we have another season called the Rogation Days, where we pray and fast specifically for the harvest. So it's right around the beginning of planting time, when you'd be sowing your seeds in the field. It's really applicable here in Moultrie. We actually do plant our seeds in the field. And then you at the end, we literally have in the prayer book a day of Thanksgiving around the harvest. Kind of matches up with the American Thanksgiving. Kind of the culmination of that prayer and fasting at the beginning of the year, and then our Thanksgiving at the harvest. So we have these different days of fasting throughout the year for different seasons. And then Lent in particular, the way it is structured is there's a distinction, and nobody gets this distinction. Most Anglicans don't get it, but it's written into the prayer book, and it's that Lent is a long season of sustained fasting. And what that means is it's not a rigorous fast, but it is a sustained fast. So I have here a little devotional book. Obviously, it's an audio podcast, but you can see it's called the St. Augustine's Prayer Book. It's just kind of it fleshes out some of these things. And it describes Lenten fasting as usually meaning not more than a light breakfast, then 1 full meal, and 1 half meal during the 40 days of Lent. And so those 40 days are the Monday through Saturdays of Lent. And then Sunday, if you actually count your days from Lent from Ash Wednesday, you actually get 46 days. That's because there's 6 Sundays. So the 6 Sundays are not days of fasting. And now this is really important here because they are days of discipline. So the whole Lenten season for a traditional Western Christian or an Anglican is a season of discipline. And so the other discipline is that of abstinence. And this is what most people, when they say, yeah, I'm giving up Facebook for Lent. Well, that's not a fast, because fasting is food. That's an abstinence. You are abstaining from Facebook during Lent. And it is very normative for people to abstain from one singular thing or a number of singular things that are related throughout the season of Lent. The most traditional that we might think about is meat. Maybe the humorous story we all know is Zwingli during the Reformation eating sausage during Lent, because it was kind of his repudiation of Lent. But the only reason it's a repudiation is because the whole area was abstaining from meat during Lent. So it would be traditional to abstain from meat or from alcohol or from dairy, or any of the above, or kind of in our modern age, it's very common for people to abstain from things like social media, or different various technological apparatuses that kind of destroy our embodied nature. And so I think that aspect, that's a really good aspect, but I think it's important to recognize that an abstention is not a fast, but that those days of discipline go together. And then as Anglicans, we would also bookend our fasts. So the first day of Lent, which is Ash Wednesday, and then the last day of Lent, Good Friday, are kind of, what's the phrasing here? I'm not going to find it initially offhand, but they're days of, in essence, strict obligation. And so days of total abstinence. So what would be presumed on Good Friday and Ash Wednesday? Presuming you're healthy, presuming you're young, fasts as far as like fasting rules go, normally don't apply to the sick or the elderly. or the extreme young, but that you would not eat anything on those days. So we're not going to say you shouldn't eat anything for all of Lent, but we are going to say, if possible, you really should not eat anything on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. Not that that makes you holier, not that that makes you closer to Jesus, but that it's asking you to do something, to give up something, to begin to learn what it means to discipline your body, as Paul says. Get control of your body, which is the temple of the Holy Spirit.
So the main purpose, you were saying, it's a preparatory time focused on disciplining the body.
Yeah.
And then there are different ways to do that. You can actually fast, meaning abstaining from food for the sake of prayer or, reflection. And that is on Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, but also throughout the day, it seems like you were saying you have like a lighter, you are conscious about having lighter meals. Is that sort of it, just
reducing the
consistently?
quantities of your,
Okay.
So how I do it,
From
I said,
day to day.
the normative is like a light breakfast and then like a large lunch and then a small dinner. What I'll do is I just
Gotcha.
totally cut breakfast out, and then I have a small lunch and a normal dinner. But that idea of, I kind of think about it is that if I leave the table stuffed during Lent, then I miss the purpose. It's kind of a season of beginning to train the appetite to say, to learn moderation, in some sense. Moderation is kind of one of the Christian virtues, and is not something that we really want to talk about much nowadays, but is, I think, really one of the things that Lent helps to form within us. And I'll be really honest, it's interesting you asking me about this. I'm really good about talking about the theoretics of Lent. But like the sin that I struggle with in my life is gluttony. Like, you put me down in front of a really good meal, and it's brutal for me to get up from that table. I'm not good at this. And then if I skip a meal, like the modern term hangry, like, I don't know, I don't struggle with blood sugar that I know about, but like, man, if I skip a meal, I'm, talk about like loving my neighbors. Oh, it's hard. And I think what Lent has taught me in a lot of ways is it's like really gotten me in touch with my depravity. It's really easy to think you're a good person when you've got a full meal on the table, your belly's full, and everything's going well. But as soon as you tell yourself, actually, I'm going to skip lunch today, and then 3 hours later, you're sitting in a meeting, and all of a sudden everything begins to grind your gears. Well, in that moment, you're able to realize, like, you know what? I'm doing this hopefully to discipline me toward, developing in me like sanctification. Like, God, I like actually can't do this at all by myself. Like, I'm pretty worthless right now. I need you to purify me. I need you to, fill me with your Spirit so that I can love these people around me, because of my own, I'm not going to love them. And I think there's a profoundly, it's one of these things. God gave us bodies, and that was good. He tells us in Genesis, and then he made these bodies to have these like physical cravings for food. Well, that's also part of his embodied creation, so it must be good. And then he asks us to not sate all of those cravings. I mean, you look at the garden. It says God creates all of these trees and everything, all the food looks good to eat. But then he tells them to abstain from one of the trees. Well, that's not because the tree of knowing good from evil was bad. Like, no, all that God created was good. But God is asking his creation to trust him more than their cravings. And, the whole story from Genesis up till now is the story of us failing to love God more than we love our appetites. And we quintessentially see that inversion in Jesus, who begins his ministry by foregoing food, foregoing the appetites. Not only foregoing the appetites, having bread brought to him, or Satan coming to him and say, I get it, you're hungry. Jesus was immortal. I'm sure his stomach was bursting in pain. And Satan says, well, turn these stones into bread. And Jesus says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And this recognition that, you know, these cravings for food that we have are good, but what is better than them is subjecting them to the will of God. And then we have Jesus in the garden, you know, not my will, but your will be done. Like that is the call of Lent.
That is, I'm even thinking about Adam. Yeah, God gives a word to him, and he doesn't live by it alone. He fulfills his appetite, and then you see the
Yeah.
second Adam. He's
Yes.
flipping that around, and that is and the point about our embodied nature is so true. I mean, I think that that's one of those things where you can tend to think like, why am I not? You know, I read a good book on this particular sin, you know, and I heard a good sermon about it, and I journal about it, and you pray about it and all that stuff, and it's like that's all good. But there is this sense of you actually have to act out. You have to live it out in particular ways, and not even just. I guess even thinking about discipline is something that you train in ways that are like you were saying. You fast so you can build that self-control muscle, so that when you need it for something that has much higher stakes, you've already developed that muscle, so to speak. And it's that sense of training that I think might be lost on certainly myself. And I'm like you. I mean, it was really convicting. I read a book called Glittering Vices. We actually did a podcast series on it about gluttony. And what are the author Rebecca DeYoung, she talks about how people think about gluttony merely in terms of like you eat too much food, you get an extra serving of pie, or you eat too much ham or whatever. And she's saying it's actually deeper than that. It's being mastered by your appetites. It's making your love for pleasure the chief end of your life. And then you go, wow, if you expand to that, you realize, well, that's how divorce happens. That's how adultery happens. That's how all kinds of these horrible things happen, because we're just mastered by our own desires and our desire for pleasure. And how, having these disciplines like fasting are really key.
Yeah, let me give you a concrete
mention,
example kind of on that. Go ahead. Is so one thing I haven't talked about yet is one of the other practices. So Lent, traditionally the church observes fasting, prayer, and charity or almsgiving or acts of mercy. And I think one thing is that they're all related. When you're fasting, you're praying. When you're serving your neighbor, you're praying. They're all driving you toward union with God. But this idea of discipline, I the other day, I had I look like a pastor when I walk around. I wear a clerical collar, which means that people ask you for things. They ask for your time. They ask you for a lot of various concerns. And I'm a very type A. When I walk out my door, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I've got exactly 5 minutes to do it. And I can be very bothered just in my spirit by these interruptions, you might say. And the other day it was so I fast on Fridays throughout the year. I'm actually a Navy chaplain, a Navy Reserve chaplain. And so my kind of endorsing body, all of the chaplains were asked to fast every Friday and pray for our fellow chaplains. So it was a Friday. I was fasting. I was hungry. I didn't feel good. And I was running very quickly into like Walmart to go buy something. And this lady stopped me and was asking for money and for food and just for me to talk to her. And obviously, everybody's initial reaction, maybe not everybody, they're much better, more godly people than I am. But my initial reaction was, please let me go on with my day. And immediately I had this thought, like, what is the point of my fast, of giving up my desires, if I can't give up my desire to serve myself? Like, that's my desire. But God is calling me to serve a higher end, which is this person created in his image who he loves standing in front of me, desiring me to turn my gaze toward her. And that was really convicting to me, in the sense of, like, that's the whole point of that discipline. Is it so that when something harder is asked of me, I've built that muscle that says, I will give up what I desire for a higher purpose. And this is, I think, what Paul is getting at in Romans 12, 1-4. This is something that's really been all of a sudden kind of like hit me over like the head with like a bucket of cold water recently. But Paul says in Romans 12:1, he says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. If we think about it, we like to either we're like super hip, anti-Gnostic, pro-embodiment, and then we only want to think about the embodiment of the creature. Or we're kind of like proto-Gnostics, and we only want to think about that the spirit is good and the flesh is bad, in this kind of like true dualism that is like totally not native to the New Testament. But what Paul is saying here is like, take your embodiment that's good and then sacrifice it. Sacrifice implies, it doesn't necessarily imply like something bloody, but it does imply giving up. Whether you offer the first fruits of your field, or you offer the first fruits of your flock, or you offer yourself, you're giving it up. So give up your bodily cravings. And then in doing that, Paul says that is holy and acceptable to God, and it is spiritual worship. So when Jesus in John chapter 4 is talking about worshiping in spirit and truth, Paul here is building and saying, what does spiritual worship look like? Worshiping in spirit and truth? Well, it looks like sacrificing your bodies. And so any act where we discipline our bodies toward the end of union with Christ is one of these acts that participates in that spiritual worship that Paul is talking about.
So that idea of that sort of, I guess, it's a wholehearted, it's a full body, mind, soul, everything being brought forward as that spiritual worship. What do you say when there is skepticism about ritualism? It just becomes a ritual, the fasting and the Lent, or even at its furthest extreme, a kind of, works righteousness kind of thing. I mean, you would mention, you're not more holy because you fasted on Good Friday. There's not like a magical cloud that descends, right? But how do you help people think about that in terms of ritualism and, a potential for legalism?
Yeah, no, I think they're very fair concerns. And I think they're fair concerns because anything that has a proper use has an improper use, or what we would call technically an abuse. But I think the important thing there is the abuse of something doesn't mean that the proper use doesn't exist. Actually, normally it points to the fact that there must be a proper use. And I think when we begin to look at fasting, maybe a better example from my own life is, so I grew up in the Lutheran Church, evangelical Lutheranism. We had these practices, but we were very much more kind of like word centric, you might say. But we fasted every year during Lent, but we were like so underemphasized the ritual that everybody was like afraid to talk about it. Like, oh, we don't want to be caught up in legalism. So like, we're entering the season of Lent, so like fasting is normal, but we aren't going to talk about it. And because of that, I was totally unformed. I had no idea why we fasted during Lent. And for me, it truly had become a rote practice that had no meaning at all. It literally just meant, oh, I won't log into Facebook or I won't eat chocolate, period. Like that was all that Lent meant to me. And it was trite and it had no meaning. I wasn't getting any holier. I was not growing in my sanctification by any means. And so I think there is absolutely a temptation for any practice, whether it's codified or not, for it to become rote, for it to lose its meaning. And I think the key is to understand why you're doing it. I mentioned the Romans 12:1. I think it's really important to combine Romans 12:1 with Romans 12:2. So right after Paul says to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, which is your spiritual worship, he then says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. That by testing, what could that testing be other than like maybe a physical testing? That's our bodies being sacrificed. That by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So we have to understand, we need to be transformed by the renewal of our mind. We have to be formed in these things. And by understanding, we're able to truly enter into them. I mean, what's interesting about Lent is, you don't grow closer to Christ just because you fasted. But there is a large possibility that through offering your body to God through a fast, that God will draw you closer to him. And so what these practices do is they give space for us as a community to corporately lean into practices together. Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 builds this incredible theology about the body of Christ. And then he kind of ends it by saying, and then you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. So there's your individuality feeds into that corporate nature, and that corporate nature then feeds into you. And then Paul immediately launches into his discussion of love. All these things, all these practices, if they're done without love, they are worth nothing. You could fast 365 days of the year for the Lord, but if you do it without love, it's worth nothing. And I think that's when we come to Lent. What Lent is offering us, it's a practice that can be abused. It can absolutely become rote. When Zwingli was eating a sausage, personally, I'm not a Zwinglian, but when Zwingli was eating a sausage, he was recognizing that this practice had become rote. And that's what he's flaunting. But just because something has become rote doesn't mean there wasn't a good intention that stood behind it. And that good intention is a annual call to the people of God to say, God is calling you to a life of picking up your cross. I mean, think about that phrase for a second. We think of crosses as like things made out of gold that we put on chains and wear around our neck. Like, that's what a cross means in our culture. When Jesus says pick up your cross, he's saying pick up the means of your death. Like, pick up what is going to kill you and then follow me. Like, I think what Lent is a season for us to really reckon with doing hard things for the gospel, so that we begin to build those spiritual muscles, that we can actually shoulder our cross upon our back. But when we shoulder it and we do it out of love, like that 1 Corinthians 13 love, then we'll find that burden is light, and that actually Christ has already carried our burdens and borne our griefs. But he asks us first to pick up the cross. And it's only in picking up that we can discover that.
It's well said. I mean, even just the communal aspect of it and how love has to be the driving force. I mean, you could turn anything like this into a very individualistic, self-focused affair and forget the larger picture. And maybe that's really behind every kind of, as you were saying, abuse of something good, is a taking of something that is meant to make you outward toward God and toward others, and redirecting it to be about you. You think about all the warnings about fasting, about, don't walk around parading that you're, this amazingly spiritual person, like it's supposed to be something that is to get you out of that kind of self-focused mindset that we don't really need much help cultivating that, I would imagine.
But and that's actually go ahead. Well, I was going to say that idea about love, I'm not inventing that wholesale. Like that's native to the practice of Lent. So the church, the Western church, from around 400 AD, maybe a little later, 500, 600, depending on what regions, used the same readings from the Bible every single Sunday up until the 1970s. So we're talking about 1600 years, including after the Reformation. So Lutherans and Anglicans and a number of other traditions continue to use these traditional readings even after the Reformation. During that 1600-year span, I don't actually know when this reading first found its way into the calendar, but we'll just presume for sake of argument, for that whole 1600 years, the Sunday before Lent, 1 Corinthians 13 was always read. The idea being,
interesting,
you're about to go into this season where you're called to do things for the gospel. But doing them means nothing if you've done them without love. And at the end of that statement, we have, and now faith, hope, and love abide. And the greatest of these is love. So we're even that question of works righteousness. Well, no, like if you're doing this just to do it and you have not faith, if you're doing this just to do it and you have not love, that's not a pleasing offering to God. We see that in Psalm 50 and Psalm 51. But when we are doing it out of love, with a contrite heart, out of faith for our Lord, who did the work so that we can now enter into that work and do the works that he's prepared for us, and we do that out of love, then that truly is a fragrant offering, as Paul says in Ephesians 5, a fragrant offering to our Lord.
You know what? That's a great spot, I think, to conclude things. I mean, that's a beautiful summary, really the heart of Lent, because when you were talking, I'm just like, you know what? It is about discipline, but it's not even, it's more than like you're disciplining for something. You're not just disciplining just to, say you're tough or you finally overcame these vices or anything like that. But ultimately the fruit of how, fasting is quote unquote working, or, that Lent is having the effect it ought to have, is you become a person who has grown in their capacity to love. You become a person who has grown in their capacity to be the kind of, to be Christ-like. I guess you could really just summarize it like that. And this is a really, I feel like we could talk for like another hour on this, because it's so fascinating, just the interconnectedness of how all this works together. But Jay, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this. This was very helpful. I certainly learned a lot, and I appreciate you being on the show. We'll put some links in the show notes to some of your writings, some of the stuff that and also your church, so people can check that out. And just appreciate you coming on the show and talking about Lent.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Brian. And like I said, as somebody who came to truly appreciate Lent after a period of it being rote, I pray that really all your listeners hearing this can look at this and see, maybe this is a time and a practice where I can strip away kind of the rote ritualism of it and really come to the heart of the gospel, which is that God is love and God is calling you to self-sacrificial love.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jay. I'll have you on again.
Great. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please support the show and consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can find all the links to our YouTube channel and our Instagram account in the show notes. Thank you guys for joining us.